Today I want to share my experience with Immortelle Corse by Parfum. And this was my first encounter with Immortelle, the first time I smelled Immortelle in a fragrance. And more so than try to define the notes I was perceiving in this fragrance, I'll try to explain the image and how it made me feel. So apart from the opening, in which I get this apricot note that gives the fragrance a bit more sweetness and slight freshness that naturally comes from a fruit, and this is combined with the smell that you will be smelling for the rest of the wear, that is, I would say, mainly Immortelle and saffron, and that come out as this very yellow, golden, sticky, slightly sweet smell. It is a very strong and potent smell. However, it doesn't feel like a cream, if that makes sense. It is dense, but Immortelle is, a flower, so in a way it still retains that lightweightness and slight airiness that floral notes generally have. And I would say like a good comparison also from another Parfum d'Empire fragrance could be Un Bel Amour d'été. That is a fragrance that I perceive to be more oily, more dense compared to Immortelle Corse. That, as I said, however, is very strong. This is a very strong Immortelle. You could say maybe a very dense Immortelle, but as I said, it still has something that's a bit airy, a bit lightweight to it. Maybe it's the saffron. When I was reading how saffron smells generally, I read that sometimes it can give this honey type of smell. Hay also I read, and I remember these two because I can see this in Immortelle Corse. So as I said, it feels a bit sticky and a bit sweet. So there is this honey-like component to it. Obviously, I don't think it's like the saffron alone. It's a combination of the various notes, but there is something that gives it a slight sweetness and stickiness. And there's also maybe a hay-like component, maybe because the fragrance just gives you this very yellow golden image. However, there is something that reminds me of a very dry yellow hay that I think contributes to making this fragrance not as dense as it could be or it could have been. There is a hint of dryness, of lightweightness, something that's, as I said, floral. You still feel outside. Maybe you're surrounded by Immortelle. As I said, it is very dense and very strong, but there is hope in a way. It isn't dense, opulent. You don't feel like you're inside in this yellow, gooey material that's blocking you and you can't escape. But don't get me wrong, it doesn't feel too much airy. As I said, it is still very strong, very present. I like it somewhat, and I want to try it also in the winter times or when it's colder outside. I've seen some people on Reddit talk about this pissy smell that Immortelle can give, and in a way I can see where you can get that imagery from. It does feel a bit like this very bright yellow, slightly warm pea. I'm sorry for the image I'm evoking at the moment, but I get why people may think that way. But as I said, it's always a slightly sweet type of smell, so it isn't like an acidic, soury type of smell. I also maybe prefer this fragrance compared to the Immortelle fragrance that I found in Les Indemodables. I've tried the Discovery set, and there was a Immortelle based fragrance that in that case was a bit less quote-unquote pure because it was mixed with maybe a tobacco note, some cacao notes, and dry fruits, maybe dates, if I'm remembering correctly how it smelled. However, I think I prefer this one more because it is strong, it is very particular, I have to say. It goes like full Immortelle, saffron, and you get this very bright yellow, slightly sweet, slightly sticky, but at times also airy and lightweight type of smell. All in all, I like this smell. It is pretty strange, and you have to smell it because it is very potent and pretty dense. However, I somewhat enjoyed it, and in fact I kept the sample of the Parfum d'Empire Discovery set precisely because I wanted to give it more wears. And as I said, I would like to try it also when it's colder outside compared to now that's summer, so it's very hot. Also, one last thing I wanted to add is that it can feel a bit spicy at times. I've seen some people say that Immortelle on their skin gives this very curry-like smell. I can get it a bit. Sometimes it feels a bit spicy, and that's maybe the reason why I want to give it more wear, because I want to see if this is evident on my skin, because I feel it more as it dries down. However, I don't get it a lot. Sometimes it might remind you of a yellowish, brownish type of spice, but mainly for me at least, it is more this honey-like, floral, very yellow, slightly sweet, as I said, sticky type of smell. I'm going to end it here. Let me know if you tried it and what you think, and see you in the next video.